The smell of damp earth filled the air at Hope Ranch, located in the lush fields of the countryside in the state of Missouri. Jacob Silver woke up before sunrise, as he did every day since his father, Samuel, had passed away. At 28, he carried not only the weight of the small family property, but also a dream that seemed increasingly distant. The mirror revealed a man with strong features, skin tanned by the relentless sun of the Midwest, and determined brown eyes inherited from his father. He put on his worn button-up shirt, faded jeans, and dusty boots that accompanied him daily through the pastures. "Today's the day, Dad," he murmured to the framed photograph on the simple wall of his room. "I'm bringing Thunder back home." Silver. Stables had seen better days. There was a time when Samuel Silver was respected throughout the region as one of the best breeders of Missouri foxtrotters. But the debts accumulated after a devastating drought forced him to make the hardest decision of his life: to sell Thunder, the newborn colt that promised to be the best horse they had ever raised. In the barn, Mrs. Margaret, Jacob's mother, was already preparing breakfast. A woman of unmatched strength, she kept the family together even when everything seemed to be falling apart. "Son, are you sure about this?" she asked, handing him a mug of strong coffee. "The auction at Horizon Farms is for the big players. That Mendelson is a dangerous man." Clarence Mendelson, owner of the largest ranch in the region and the current owner of Thunder, was known for the power he wielded and the cruelty with which he treated his business adversaries. "I have no choice, Mom. I found the contract Dad made before he passed. We have a legal right to Thunder if he's put up for sale, and tomorrow he'll be at the auction." The document had been found by chance on a rainy afternoon while Jacob was organizing his father's old papers. It was a buyback clause, signed by Mendelson in a moment of carelessness or overconfidence. Samuel, even in his misfortune, had been clever enough to secure a chance to reclaim the animal. In the small town of Greenfield, the annual horse auction completely transformed the quiet routine. Hotels were packed, restaurants were reserved, and streets were filled with luxury cars, bringing a temporary cosmopolitan air to the town. At the event center, colorful banners announced 42nd National Missouri Fox Trotter Auction, the best of rural America. Arriving in his old pickup truck, Jacob felt the curious and disdainful glances. At the registration desk, the clerk looked him up and down. "Full name?" "Jacob Silver." She checked the list and frowned. "Are you registered as a buyer?" "Yes, I am." The woman couldn't hide her surprise. After all, everyone knew that the Silver family could barely keep their property afloat. "Here's your badge. The main session starts at 2 in the afternoon." In the VIP area, the big breeders and investors chatted animatedly, champagne glasses in hand. Jacob recognized several of them: Colonel Brandon from Texas, the Azevedo brothers from Oklahoma, and of course Clarence Mendelson, in his impeccable suit and artificial smile. "Well, well, look who's gracing us with his presence," exclaimed Mendelson upon spotting Jacob. Samuel's son decided to leave the barn to see how the big players live. Laughter echoed through the hall. Next to Mendelson was his daughter Laura, who kept her eyes fixed on Jacob. Unlike her father, there was no mockery in her gaze, only genuine curiosity. "I came to participate in the auction like any other breeder," Jacob replied, maintaining his composure. "Breeder?" The older man let out a laugh. "That pigsty you call a stable can barely feed the chickens. What do you plan to buy here? A stuffed pony?" Jacob felt his blood boil but remained calm. He knew Mendelson's game of provocation well. "We'll see at the auction, Mr. Mendelson." As he walked away, Jacob felt a hand on his arm. It was Laura. "Don't. Mind my father," she said softly. "He's nervous because Thunder is being auctioned today and there are many interested parties." "Thunder?" Jacob feigned surprise. "The son of Tempest and Aurora? I thought your father would never sell him." "The veterinarian's diagnosed an old injury. He says it's no longer worth keeping." That information wasn't in the auction announcements. The injury could be a problem for executing the buyback contract. Jacob felt a chill but didn't show it. "Interesting," he simply said. "See you at the auction then." As he walked away, he didn't notice Laura Mendelson's lingering gaze or the genuine interest he sparked in the young veterinarian, recently graduated and secretly critical of her father's methods. The clock read 1:45 p.m. when Jacob took his seat in the audience. In 15 minutes, the fate of Silver Stables would be decided, and with it, the chance to honor his father's last wish. The auctioneer, Thomas Martin, adjusted the microphone as the last buyers took their seats. He was a 60-year-old man known for his eloquence and for favoring the big ranchers when conducting events. The main hall of the Greenfield Convention Center was packed, with over 300 people seated in a semicircle, all facing the stage where the animals would be presented. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 42nd National Missouri Foxtrotter Auction, he announced pompously. Today we present exceptional specimens of our most traditional breed. Jacob observed the environment carefully, studying the potential competitors. Clarence Mendelsohn occupied a privileged table at the front, accompanied by his daughter Laura and his personal lawyer, Dr. Oliver Myers, a man with a severe appearance and a calculating gaze. The first lots were presented to enthusiastic applause. Colts, broodmares, and stallions paraded across the stage, while impressive amounts were announced. Jacob remained silent, waiting patiently. "And now, gentlemen, we present Lot 17 Thunder of Horizons," Thomas announced with special enthusiasm. Son of the legendary Tempest and the national champion Aurora, this 6-year-old Missouri Foxtrotter. Stallion has an impeccable lineage. Thunder entered the stage led by a handler. He was a magnificent horse with a shiny black coat, a proud stance, and perfect musculature. Jacob's heart raced as he recognized the horse he had seen born. Even after years, there was something familiar in the way the horse moved, in the way it arched its neck. "Starting bid, $200,000, announced the auctioneer. Colonel Brandon was the first to raise his paddle. Then other buyers joined in. The price quickly rose to $400,000. Jacob remained still, watching. When the bid reached $500,000, only 2 interested parties remained, rancher Paul Azevedo and a breeder from Chicago whose name Jacob didn't know. It was then that he raised his paddle. $510,000, announced the auctioneer, barely hiding his surprise. A murmur spread through the hall. Clarence Mendelsohn shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Laura watched Jacob with renewed interest. $550,000, countered Paul Azevedo. $600,000, the Chicago breeder shot back. $610,000. Jacob raised his paddle again. The laughter started discreetly, then grew louder. Everyone knew the Silvers didn't have that kind of money. Clarence leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, who nodded discreetly. $700,000, shouted Paul Azevedo, looking challengingly at Jacob. The hall fell silent. It was an absurd amount, even for a horse of Thunder's quality. The auctioneer smiled, satisfied. $700,000 to Mr. Azevedo. Are we sold? Jacob stood up. With firm steps, he walked to the stage under astonished gazes. "Excuse me, Mr. Martin. Before finalizing the sale, I'd like to present this document." He handed the auctioneer the buyback contract, duly authenticated and registered. Thomas adjusted his glasses and quickly read the paper. His expression changed completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received relevant information. There is a buyback clause registered in the name of Samuel Silver, transferable to his heirs." The audience erupted in chatter. Clarence Mendelsohn stood up abruptly. "This is absurd. This contract is invalid," he shouted, approaching the stage. Dr. Myers followed him, examining the document with forced attention. "This horse has an undeclared injury at the time of the original sale," argued the lawyer. "There's a specific clause that invalidates the buyback right if the animal isn't in perfect health." Thomas Martin seemed uncomfortable, torn between following protocol and catering to Mendelsohn's interests. "Well, in this case, we need an impartial veterinary evaluation to determine the animal's condition and the contract's validity." It was then that Laura Mendelsohn stood up. With a determined stride, she approached the microphone. "As the veterinarian responsible for Horizon Stables, I can confirm that Thunder has an injury in his right hind leg." She paused dramatically, looking directly at her father. "However, this injury was documented and dated. It occurred 2 years ago, long after my father acquired the animal. Clarence paled. Laura, what do you think you're doing? I'm telling the truth, Dad. As a professional, I have a responsibility for the reports I sign. The lawyer tried to intervene. Even so, the current market value far exceeds the amount stipulated in the contract. We can't accept. Jacob spoke again. The contract clearly stipulates the buyback price as the same as the original sale, adjusted for official inflation. I have the exact calculation here and the proof of the judicial deposit made yesterday. The auctioneer, after quickly consulting the event's legal team, took the microphone again. After reviewing the documentation, I inform you that the Silver family's buyback right is legitimate. Lot 17 is sold at the contractual price to Mr. Jacob Silver. A spontaneous round of applause erupted from some attendees, impressed by the turn of events. Others, especially those with business ties to Mendelssohn, remained in stony silence. Clarence, his face red with fury, pointed a finger at Jacob. You're not taking this horse. I have ways to stop this. No, Dad, enough, intervened Laura, stepping between the two men. You promised to follow the auction rules. All the documents are in order. Her words seemed to hit Mendelssohn like a bucket of cold water. He looked around, noticing the disapproving gazes directed at him. His reputation was at stake. This isn't over, Silver, he muttered, before turning on his heel and storming out. As the remaining lots were announced, Jacob was taken backstage to finalize the paperwork. As he passed through the corridor leading to the stalls, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Laura. Why didn't you tell me you had the buyback contract? She asked with genuine curiosity. For the same reason you didn't tell your father I was here to bring Thunder back, Jacob replied with a half-smile. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of admiration and something else, something Jacob couldn't quite define. My father isn't an easy man to confront, she said. Be careful. He doesn't accept defeat. I'm not worried. Now it's just a matter of justice. Laura hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but simply nodded and walked away. Jacob watched her go, with the strange feeling that this wouldn't be their last encounter. That night, as he prepared Thunder for the journey back to Silver Stables, Jacob had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. What seemed like the happy ending of a long journey was, in fact, the prelude to greater conflicts, where long-buried family secrets would come to light and test not only his determination, but also his heart. The dawn brought a thick fog that covered the pastures of Silver Stables. Jacob watched Thunder adapting to his new home, or rather returning to the place he should never have left. The horse explored the terrain with curiosity, as if trying to recognize scents and sounds from a distant past. He seems happy, commented Mrs. Margaret, approaching with a mug of hot coffee. Your father would be proud. There's still a lot to do to get the stables back on their feet, Mom, but with Thunder here we have a chance. The news of Jacob's victory at the auction spread quickly through the region. Some neighbors came to see the famous horse and congratulate the young breeder. However, not everyone was celebrating. At Horizons Ranch, Clarence Mendelssohn called an emergency meeting with his lawyer and foreman. I want that animal back, he shouted, slamming his hand on the desk of his luxurious office. Samuel Silver tricked me with that contract, and now his son thinks he can humiliate me publicly. Legally, our options are limited, pondered Dr. Myers. The contract was validated by the county judge. I don't care about legality. There are other ways. It was then that the door burst open and Laura entered, her eyes blazing with indignation. Don't even think about it, Dad. Isn't the humiliation at the auction enough? Do you want to turn this into an even bigger scandal? You betrayed your own family, Laura, accused Mendelssohn. Why are you defending that hick? I'm defending the truth. Thunder's injury is only 2 years old, and it was caused by the negligent treatment he received here. Your handlers pushed him beyond his limits in abusive training. Sessions. The old rancher paled but maintained his arrogant posture. Get out of here. I don't need your opinion to handle my affairs. Laura slammed the door as she left. In her car, she let the tears flow freely. Her relationship with her father had always been tumultuous, but now it was on the verge of breaking. Without much thought she started the engine, and headed towards Silver Stables. At the same time, Jacob discovered a box of old photographs in the attic of the main house. Among the yellowed images, he found something that intrigued him, a photo of his father, still young next to Clarence Mendelssohn. Both were smiling, seeming like close friends. On the back, an inscription, "Partners in Life and Business, 1985. "Mom," he called, rushing down the stairs. "Did you know Dad and Mendelssohn were friends?" Mrs. Margaret sat heavily on the kitchen chair, as if a great burden had been placed on her shoulders. "I thought we'd never need to talk about this, son. Your father wanted to take this secret to the grave." "What secret?" Samuel and Clarence weren't just friends. They were partners at the beginning of their careers. Together, they bought this land and started what would become the largest stables in the region. The revelation hit Jacob like a thunderbolt. What happened? "Your father discovered that Clarence was embezzling money and falsifying animal records to sell horses without pedigrees as purebreds. When he confronted him, Clarence set up a situation to frame Samuel." Mrs. Margaret wiped a furtive tear. "Your father was accused of fraud. He lost his credibility in the market. To save what was left of his reputation, he agreed to dissolve the partnership, keeping only this piece of land and a few animals. Clarence took everything else." "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" "Your father was afraid you'd seek revenge. He wanted to protect you from the bitterness that consumed him for years." The sound of a car interrupted the conversation. Through the window, they saw Laura Mendelssohn parking near the barn. "What's she doing here?" asked Mrs. Margaret, apprehensive. "I'll find out." As he left the house, Jacob found Laura examining Thunder, who seemed to recognize her. "He's adapting well," she commented without turning around. "What brings you here, Dr. Mendelssohn? Came to check if we're treating our horse well?" She finally faced him, her eyes still red from crying. "I came to warn you. My father hasn't given up. He wants Thunder back at any cost." "Why do you care?" "Because I'm tired of the injustices my father commits in the name of power and pride." She hesitated, then continued, "And because I found something in the ranch's archives that you need to see." Laura handed him a folder. Inside were old documents, the original partnership contract between Samuel and Clarence, and letters proving Jacob's father's innocence in the fraud accusation. "Where did you find this?" "In my father's private safe. He always kept these documents hidden like a trophy of his victory over your father." Jacob felt a growing anger. "Did you know about all this?" "No. I found out last night after the auction. I started questioning why my father was so obsessed with Thunder, beyond the horse's value. That's when I found an old diary of his where he confessed everything." A heavy silence fell between them. Thunder approached as if sensing the tension in the air. "Why are you helping me?" Jacob finally asked. "Because I want to correct a mistake that destroyed 2 families, and because—" She paused, unsure if she should continue. The roar of an engine interrupted the moment. 3 pickup trucks sped through the property's gate. Clarence Mendelssohn stepped out of the first, followed by 4 men. "So my own daughter betrays me twice in one day," he shouted, advancing toward them. "Dad, stop this," Laura pleaded, stepping in front of Jacob. "Get out of the way, Laura. This is between me and Samuel's son." Jacob stepped forward. "It's not just between us anymore, Mendelssohn. Now I know the whole truth about what you did to my father." The old rancher paled as he saw the folder in Jacob's hands. "You wouldn't understand. It was a different time. Business required certain adjustments." "Adjustments? You destroyed my father. You stole everything he built." Mrs. Margaret came out of the house, alarmed by the commotion. "Clarence Mendelssohn, you still have the audacity to step on our land after all you've done." The rancher seemed to age 10 years upon seeing his former partner's widow. "Margaret, don't try to explain. 20 years of lies are enough." It was then, to everyone's surprise, that Dr. Myers stepped out of one of the trucks, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Mendelssohn, I believe this situation has gotten out of hand. As your lawyer, I suggest a peaceful resolution." "What are you talking about, Oliver? We came to take back what's mine." "Incorrect. The lawyer opened the briefcase and pulled out some documents. After your daughter left, I did a thorough review of the records. The original partnership contract was never legally dissolved. Technically, Mr. Jacob Silver owns 50% of all properties and assets registered in your name since 1985. A tomb-like silence filled the air. Clarence staggered, leaning on one of his men. That's impossible. The law is clear, Mr. Mendelssohn, and as your lawyer, I must inform you that any action against this property would not only be illegal but could also result in criminal charges related to the old fraud you committed. Laura approached her father, taking his trembling hands. Dad, enough, it's time to do what's right, Laura said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This feud has gone on for too long. It's destroyed too much. Let it end here. Clarence Mendelssohn looked at his daughter, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something that might have been regret. For a moment it seemed as though he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. Fine, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Fine, but this isn't over, Silver, not by a long shot. Jacob stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. It is over, Mendelssohn. You lost. But this doesn't have to be the end. We can move forward, both of us, if you're willing to let go of the past. Clarence glared at him, but there was no real fire in his eyes anymore. He turned to Dr. Myers, who was still holding the briefcase filled with damning documents. Get me out of here, he said gruffly. The lawyer nodded and gestured for the men to follow. They climbed back into the trucks, and within moments the vehicles were speeding down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Laura watched them go, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. He'll never admit it, but you got to... Him? She said quietly. He knows he can't win this time. Jacob nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The documents you found, they're proof of everything. We can use them to protect what's left of my father's legacy. Laura turned to him, her eyes searching his face. And what about us? Where do we go from here? Jacob hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. We start over. Together. You and me, we can rebuild what our fathers destroyed. Not just the stables, but everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was genuine. I'd like that, she said softly. Over the next few weeks, the two of them worked tirelessly to sort through the legal mess left behind by their fathers. With the help of Dr. Myers, who had decided to cut ties with Clarence and side with Laura, they were able to secure Jacob's rightful share of the properties and assets. It wasn't easy. Clarence fought them every step of the way, but in the end the law was on their side. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob and Laura grew closer. They spent long hours together, planning the future of Silver Stables and Horizons Ranch. They talked about merging the two properties, creating something new and better than either of them could have imagined. And through it all, Thunder was there, a constant reminder of the bond that had brought them together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jacob and Laura stood side by side, watching Thunder gallop across the pasture. The horse moved with a grace and power that took Jacob's breath away, just as it had the first time he'd seen him. He's happy here, Laura said, breaking the silence. He belongs here. Jacob nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. He does, and so do we. Laura turned to him, her eyes shining with something that looked a lot like hope. Do you really think we can do this? Start over, I mean, after everything. That's happened. Jacob took her hand and squeezed it gently. I do. We've got everything we need, each other, Thunder, and a second chance. That's more than most people get. Laura smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Then let's make the most of it. As they stood there, watching the sun set over the land that had once divided them, Jacob felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The past was behind them now, and the future was theirs to shape. Together, they would build something new, something strong and lasting, just like the bond they had forged in the shadow of their father's mistakes. And as Thunder galloped freely across the pasture, his mane flowing in the wind, Jacob knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Laura by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The story of Jacob and Laura was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were finally on the right path. And that, Jacob thought, was something worth fighting for,